Hi, folks, and welcome to another Real and Draw conversation. This time we have a very strong panel. We have a new guest with us, Olga Deutsch, who is very welcome to join this Wednesday's webinars. And we have the return of Ruchie Avital. I've been trying to pronounce her name correctly, and apparently I did. Marco is not that unhappy with the way I'm pronouncing it. So I think that's a good start for our conversation today. So in terms of topics, I think it's something of your interest if you have been following us for the last few months. So today we have NGO accountability and transparency, Israel advocacy, narrative, warfare and censorship, funding, lawfare and EU-backed activism, and ethics, propaganda and the human rights industry. So if you are into this, stay around for the next 90 minutes. Make sure to provide your input. We want to provide you with a dynamic conversations. We will expect your comments, your questions. We expect this to be dynamic, and it's good that we can count with you on the other side. And if you enjoy what we do here, make sure to express your satisfaction by pressing the like button below. If you haven't subscribed, it would be great if you can, because that's how these things get distributed. And if you know someone who is into this sort of conversations and they're not aware of what we do here, it would be great if you can share. So without any further delays, I'm just going to greet Marco. How are things in Jerusalem?
Wonderful, wonderful. It's always wonderful to be in Jerusalem, our capital, lest anybody be in any doubt.
Great. Okay, so let's jump into the topics. I'm very looking forward to hear from both of you, Ruchie and Olga. So Olga, for those who don't know, she is a part of NGO Monitor. So I'm sure she has a lot to say on that regard. So I'd like to ask you, what mechanisms currently exist to hold NGOs accountable for their actions and funding sources, especially in conflict zones like the Middle East?
So first of all, Vitor and Marco, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having me join this distinguished panel. And particularly on these topics, I mean, not to say that even 90 minutes is not enough to cover all of these, but I do hope we will give it a try, especially in the context that will be useful to the audience and handy in trying to navigate everyday's challenges and dilemmas, and there are many, especially since October the 7th. Let me just start by saying a few words about NGO Monitor so that the listeners and viewers understand where my expertise on this subject comes from. NGO Monitor is an Israeli-based research organization. We're based in Jerusalem, founded and still presided by Professor Gerald Steinberg. And we are unique globally. There is no other organization that uniquely looks into the activities of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that are active within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We do that with a mandate to defend Israel's right to exist, particularly within the human rights space. But this phenomenon is not unique. There is an abuse of NGO structures and NGOs and charities around the world and just about in any conflict zone. What is unique for our context is the magnitude and the volume and the disproportional focus that is being given to the conflict and to Israel, and how Israel is almost uniformly presented as a pariah state, as a violator of human rights, and so on. So actually, we are studying the phenomenon where these self-proclaimed human rights and humanitarian organizations, NGOs, instead of promoting human rights and humanitarian causes, they actually distort their mandates and go after Israel. And if you allow me to zoom out and put it in the context of today, they basically jointly make up what we call political warfare against Israel globally. So your question is whether there are mechanisms that provide accountability or of any sort when it comes to NGOs. My background is in business, so I like to compare everything in business terms, and I like to look at the world in terms of markets. So typically we have the private sector, right? And then we have the public sector. In both of these, we have same principle and same system and rules that apply, right? We have a reality that, say, one tweet can today incriminate, or one photo, as we have seen from the Coldplay concert, can incriminate the CEO of a major company and cost him his position. The same is the case with our elected officials, right? We have the rules of the free market where there is demand and there is a response to the demand. And if a product is not good enough, then the market will punish it. When it comes to the third sector, or the civil society as we call it, there are absolutely no rules that apply, meaning that we live in a reality where today anyone, including all of us here on this podcast, can create an organization, decide to call it a human rights organization. And if I'm really good at talking and I'm really good at lobbying governments and fundraising, then in no time I can become an authority on human rights, on international law, and this is exactly what happens. And then we have people who are political activists that are being quoted in congressional hearings, in official documents of different governments, in UN documents. So it's a long answer to your seemingly simple question. When it comes to the civil society, there's absolutely no scrutiny and there's absolutely no uniform rules of accountability. If we were to talk about accountability, we actually have to start from transparency, right? A government or a company has to comply with the laws of funding sources, annual reports, quarterly reports, and so on. When it comes to NGOs, in most countries, they have absolutely no obligation to display or disclose their funding sources. And then we have situations, I can take you out of the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where last year in Brussels, in the heart of European Union, there was what they called a Qatar Gate that was all about NGOs, where there was an NGO that was basically paying money to members of the European Parliament to fabricate human rights reports issued by the European Union for Qatar ahead of the Mondial, right? The global football championship. And why this happens? It's important for people to understand, because NGOs are not regulated, so they're actually the easiest to abuse. Now, when we take everything that I just said and we zoom it into conflict zones, right, and war-ridden zones where terror elements and terror organizations thrive and are oftentimes the prevailing forces, then this does not merely become a failure of promoting and protecting human rights, but these NGOs can become the vehicles, the proxies of these terror organizations that serve two purposes. And this is exactly what is happening right now in the context of the political war against Israel, where these NGOs are serving as proxies for Palestinian terror organizations, and they have two goals. One goal is to normalize and oftentimes romanticize Hamas and other Palestinian organizations. And this is how we have a situation where we discuss with BBC whether Hamas is a terrorist organization or they're just combatants, right, in their coverage. And the second goal is to continue to erode the legitimacy of what the state of Israel is doing, what the Israeli army, IDF, is doing, as a counterbalance to that, right? So you have eroding legitimacy and international standing, normalization of terror organizations, and that the political warfare is complementary to the rockets and terror attacks and the physical warfare done by these terror organizations.
That's you raise some interest. Sorry, Vitor, did you want to chip in there?
No, I just want to put a comment from Terry here. Apologies, Marco. So Terry is saying all NGOs have to go and be held accountable in depth. So not much sympathy towards NGOs from Terry. Marco, you can.
Okay. Okay, so what I wanted to ask you, you speak of terror organizations that use NGOs as proxies, but what about state actors that use NGOs as proxies? And I'm speaking most about the EU itself. Would it not be possible to assume that it is indeed the EU that sees these NGOs as channels to further, for certainly for what us is a pernicious policy? Because I see so many NGOs that are financed by the European Union. So perhaps I'd like to suggest to you that there is something even a little more sinister than mere terrorist organizations, but indeed a political organization, or whatever you want to call the EU, that purposefully, willingly, and knowingly, and perhaps has even some role in the foundation of these NGOs. I put that to you.
Well, it's an excellent observation and perhaps an opportunity for me to split the phenomenon in at least two. Okay, so we jump-started the conversation with NGOs that serve as proxies for terror organizations. But then this phenomenon becomes that much more interesting when we know that the EU and other European governments, and sometimes US and Canada, fund some of these organizations. It's important to understand how this happens, especially the difference between North America, particularly US, and Europe is in how they promote even democracy. So, and it is cultural. After the Second World War, it was very important for Europe to actually develop a strong and thriving civil society, because they were afraid that there might be another Nazi Germany or extremist government coming to power. So they said we need a third body, a third community, basically a civil society that at any given moment should hold us accountable as a counterbalance, and it's supposed to be complementary to the government. But as opposed to North America, where charities are supported by private foundations, by individuals, and so on, corporations, in Europe, the giving culture is not as developed on individual level as is the case in North America. So the governments actually stepped in and they said, we will make sure that there is a civil society. So this explains why the EU is the single largest aid donor in the world, not only in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And when I say aid donor, people usually think that aid is, humanitarian aid. And in the context of Gaza, that would be flour, medication, tents, clothes, and so on. But the biggest portion of aid actually goes to what is called development cooperation aid, human rights, democracy, sustainable development, liberties, empowerment of women, and so on around the world. So EU is the single largest donor of aid globally. If we don't look at the transnational level, which is the European Union, then, for example, Germany is the single largest donor as a singular country, meaning that even on that level, European countries lead the way. That explains why they are very present. Now, let's zoom in to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So when the Oslo Accord came about, the European countries and the European Union came and they said, now we want to support the two-state solution. And as part of that, we want to invest and inject a lot in the Palestinian civil society and in the civil society in general. And then two things happen in parallel. On the Palestinian side, there was a group of people, activists, most of them came out of the PA itself. So, and what is PA? For example, PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, is also a political party. So is Hamas, right? Exactly. But most of them also have arms, terror wings, right? And they're also designated terror organizations. So particularly PFLP figured out that they can create a bunch of NGOs, call them human rights, and we find ourselves in a reality where they actually have They have one dealing with women, one dealing with agricultural issues, one dealing with children, seemingly all human rights. But in practice, they're proxies for PFLP. Now, they achieve two things through this. They also obviously get an enormous amount of money, but also they get an incredible amount of legitimacy and platform by being able to put the logo of the EU or German government or British government, right, on their activities and brochures and booklets. But during continuous financial support, they also become trusted partners by this government, so they keep inviting them to panels and expert sessions and so on. In parallel, on the Israeli side, the EU and other European governments started investing in Israeli civil society, but they did so in a very politicized way. And I'm choosing my words carefully.
Understatement.
Here. Exactly. They basically, and over the years, this phenomenon has become much more dramatic. Okay, if it started with supporting organizations who were critical a little bit of the government or critical of the IDF, very pro-Palestinian, opposing occupation and so on. And I quote the terminology that they use. Today, we have a situation, we just issued a new report that covers EU funding for Israeli NGOs for 2024. We have a situation in which the EU gave 7.2 million euros to 14 projects involving only politicized Israeli groups. One such group is B'Tselem, who I'm sure most of the people here on the call have heard of. And I don't even know how to really, truly refer to them, because this is an Israeli registered organization that goes by the name of Human Rights. And yet they say in their reports that Israel is perpetuating genocide, and they call for the international community to apply all means available according to the international law to prevent Israeli governmental, so systematic genocide of the Palestinian people, to save, and I quote, save whoever is still able to be saved. They say that every institution created by the State of Israel is basically a prerequisite that allows this genocide to go on. And when they say, a lot of people don't understand this, when they say any means within the parameters of the international law, I am originally from Serbia, so I can say this with authority. This includes deploying NATO forces, for example, right? This could eventually include, this can range from what we're witnessing now, which is the EU revisiting Israel's partnership in Horizon 2020. This could mean calling for the International Criminal Court in The Hague to persecute Israeli soldiers. But this could, in theory, also mean military intervention, because the international law, in theory, allows this. So B'Tselem is one such organization. But then you also have an Israeli organization like Zulat, ran by Zava Galon, who is a former Meretz member of the Knesset. And in practice, what really happens there is that Zava Galon doesn't get elected into the Knesset. And then she created an NGO. She gets a grant from the EU and other governments to do exactly the same work that she did in the Knesset while she was an MK. Because the EU approved a grant to this NGO to actually do two things: to lobby and amend legislation in the Knesset, and to go and be active in the Supreme Court of Israel on two issues. One is the freedom to demonstrate in Israel. And let me remind you, this is a grant that the EU approved in 2023, in the peak of the demonstrations in Israel, right, over judicial reform for 2024. And the second issue is to diminish the violence of Israeli police. Now, we can talk about, I can give you abundance of other examples of Israeli NGOs that the EU and other European governments support, but I want to talk less about each NGO, because there's crazy NGOs everywhere. And there's always going to be fringe, politicized, sometimes anti-Semitic NGOs, they promote anti-Semitism, some with their affiliation, but that is not the challenge for us. The challenge is engaging with elected officials and policymakers on how to deal with this issue, right? So we have a situation where in the year following the greatest massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, the EU does not change course. They don't stop and say, hold on. And these are, this is 7 million euros designated for advocacy projects in the field of human rights. So you would think that an advocacy project in the field of human rights could be advocating for the rights of the hostages or advocating for the rights of the survivors of Nova or advocating for the access to mental health treatments for the displaced children. And I can go on and on and on, right? In terms of the different groups that the EU could have chosen to support advocating for. And yet we find ourselves in a situation where actually the EU does not change course at all following the October the 7th. And then we really get to the core of the issue. On one side, you have EU officials continuously issuing public statements where they support Israel's right to defend itself. They stand by our side. They send delegations to Jerusalem. They visit the South. But in practice, they support organizations who undermine that very right. Because B'Tselem is the organization that calls for the International Criminal Court in The Hague to arrest Israeli soldiers, right? And for the international community to sanction Israel over its allegedly apartheid and genocidal and policies. You have an organization like Zulat and many others who, instead of supporting human rights in Israel, they basically go and weaken Israeli democracy because they tire it, right, with useless legal cases and so on. So
yes, vexatious legal cases,
exactly.
which is part of.
To me, that is the core issue. It's not each of these NGOs, because as I said, there's crazy everywhere, right? And we will never be able to eradicate all haters in the world. We will never be able to eradicate all terrorists or all anti-Semites. But what we can do is engage in a conversation with friendly governments with which Israel has thriving bilateral relations and address two issues. Number one, why would you, in a country like Israel, which is a thriving democracy, even interfere on our internal issues? And number two, why would you do that in supporting projects which directly undermine your official statement? And just the last thing that sort of answers that question in a cynical manner, they do that exactly because Israel is a democracy, because it's easy to support human rights in a democracy such as the Israeli one, where the Israeli society and democratic structures allow these groups to exist and freely issue their statements. You know, I wrote a piece following the war between Israel and Iran, the last one now, a month ago, and I challenged the European Union, the international community, to actually now mobilize all the funds and all the goodwill and all these instruments to do exactly that, but in a society like Iran, where building a civil society could make a difference, where there are no human rights, right? But instead they choose to go the easy way and call it human rights while they're actually meddling with Israeli internal issues in a democracy that is a thriving one.
Ruchie, have you anything to you'd like to
I just find this, I find it very sad, of course, and discouraging, but also extremely ironic, because Europe itself is facing a threat from these very same forces with and it has to allow its courts force it to allow demonstrations in the street that call for an end to democracy, that call for the imposition of Sharia law and the caliphate in Germany and in England and so on. And it's, it's just democracy committing suicide. It's really democracy, we have the same problem in Israel. It's built in that the forces of darkness, in our case, it's Islamic forces and anti-Semitic forces and so on, exploit what we like to think of as the strength of democracy, freedom of speech and the freedom to demonstrate and so on, against the democracy itself, against democratic governments. It's kind of a vicious cycle. It's a kind of a situation that is very difficult to resolve. So in Europe or in England, let's say, for example, you can be arrested if you post on Twitter something against a minority, against immigrants, let's say, but those immigrants can demonstrate in the streets and say the vilest anti-Semitic, anti-democratic, anti-English things, and they're safe. So it's such a difficult situation, and there's a willful blindness in Europe. And you didn't even talk about, Olga, you didn't even talk about what happened with US aid in the United States, which was a huge funnel of funds to all these NGOs as well. You just focused on Europe, which is bad enough, but it was going on in America as well. And it's difficult to understand. We see these societies basically allowing themselves to be destroyed from within.
Well, absolutely. We were focusing on Europe and the EU because of the few examples that were brought up here. And you mentioned USAID. Look, what happened after the Trump administration came into the office is almost amazing, because it is seemingly a disruptive process that will push the entire aid structure in the US to be reformed. It is not to say that the US will no longer provide aid. That is not going to happen. But this will have pushed them to revise how they vet, who they work with, how they choose their partners, how do they choose their projects, to make sure that they don't approve projects year in, year out on autopilot, right? Without really asking them, what have you achieved? Does your project even bring about any change? And so on and so on. And I think this is this is a crucial thing in a democratic society, because what is aid provided by a government? We're talking about taxpayers' money. So, and hardworking people provide a lot of money through their taxes, and they deserve in a democracy to have both transparency as to how their funds are being used, as well as accountability, right? Some sort of reporting and oversight. And with these three key words, I actually want to maybe give a more complex answer to your question. Again, yes, there are many big challenges, and what is happening in Israel is not unique. It is disproportionate in the magnitude, and it is maybe emblematic. Right? And we like to say it always starts with the Jews, but it definitely never ends with the Jews. And, when there's anti-Semitism on the rise in any one society, it is usually the best barometer in terms of how unhealthy that society is when it comes to liberties, freedoms, and so on. So if that is truly the barometer, then we are globally in a big problem. And I think that is exactly what you were referring to. By far surpassing Israel-related or Jewish community-related, anti-Semitism-related issues, we are in sort of a clash of civilizations where, the denial of national identity or pride of any kind is being placed into dogmatic, quasi-secular political order that is maybe more religious than any religion in how dogmatic it is. And if you don't toe the line, you're immediately labeled as fascist, hater, ultra this or ultra that. But again, our challenge is not to, because I don't think we would ever be able to do that, to deal with each one of these voices individually. When it comes to public funds, right? So what the governments provide and lending platform and so on, it is all about how a government defines red lines and where it sets them, making sure that the government after that clearly communicates to grantees, right, to NGOs, that it is going to support financially, that these are red lines, and should you cross them, I'm going to check you, right? And if I see that you crossed any one of the lines, this is the sanction that will happen. Because this seemingly simple system, I mean, think when we teach children, rules. This is exactly what we're supposed to tell them. These are the rules. You can play, but within the garden. This is the fence. And look, I'm going to let you function freely because we're a democracy, right? But within the fences of the playground. If you cross the fences, A, B, and C is going to happen. These seemingly simple rules are not existent today. Most of the governments are, to start with, not transparent. The EU, for example, does have an annual system where they publish the grants and the NGOs that they support, but this too comes with a year delay, right? So it takes time but this is one of the best transparency systems out there. Germany, for example, is one of the least transparent governments in the world, where you can absolutely not find any public information, almost, issued by the government itself as to who they fund, how they fund them, or what are the projects that they fund. And Germany, for example, has one of the most convolvulent NGO support systems, because they have at least 34 different mechanisms through which they fund NGOs. And in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, usually the same 50, 60 NGOs. So now, if this hasn't blown your mind, now add to that same Germany will give money that will go to NGOs through the EU and through the UN. So then we get to a place where it's a lot of money. It's a full-blown industry that garners a lot of influence globally and can dictate the discourse. And I think we are seeing full scale of it this week. We have a situation where an international campaign, libelous campaign, the Starvation campaign, that was spearheaded by NGOs. And this is something that needs to be said here out loud. The Starvation campaign started on October the 8th, 2023. This is when the NGOs first started the Starvation campaign. The events of October the 7th haven't physically ended yet, and they have already started a Starvation campaign. But now in the last month or two, we have seen this campaign culminate, and this unbelievably powerful campaign has actually influenced the course of war and pushed Israel to basically change its official policy. And, I'm being asked all the time, so what do you not care that there are children and civilians in Gaza who are hungry? Do you not care about the humanitarian catastrophe? And I start actually off by saying the humanitarian situation in Gaza is grave. There's absolutely no other way of calling it. Of course it is, after 20 months of war. Poor people. Yet anyone who equates civilians in Gaza and the hostages, or in this case, completely cancels hostages, right? Through this campaign, is making a joke out of human rights and is using the predicament of the poor civilians in Gaza for their political and politicized campaign. I'm deliberately zigzagging seemingly, between different issues, but they all interconnect in showing how NGOs, which traditionally and typically most of the people think of like, there's a human rights group, it's a bunch of activists on the ground. Actually,
naive, well-meaning.
Exactly. But they can move mountains and they can influence official positions, and this is in good case. In a worst case scenario, they can spread fear and mongering. They can call and incite for physical violence, like we have seen on campuses in North America, right? Mobilize whether they're useful or not useful idiots, or who don't even know from which river to which sea, but yet they showed up and they demonstrated and they mortified the local Jewish communities. And in that sense, they are neither naive nor benign, right, in what they do. And especially when we know that they're extremely well funded and extremely well coordinated. There was absolutely nothing organic or spontaneous about the encampments and the protests in North America. How is it that on October the 8th, they all had the same campaign, the same tents, the same slogans, and incredible funding to say the same things on multiple campuses? If you follow the money, which is what we do at NGO Monitor, then you get to the bottom line and you get the answer. And again, it is all about how we as a society can now look at this phenomenon into its face and say, we cannot do what we have been doing until now. It cannot go the same way.
So this has clearly been a well thought out plan. It didn't begin on October the 7th, as many naive people believe. This is a coordinated attack, which has been coordinated on many levels, and we should recognize, I think, the NGO as being part of that front. I don't think we should be separating it from terrorist organizations, because they are pursuing essentially the same agenda. It's a bit of a good cop, bad cop scenario. The thing is, they have the power to shape perceptions, but I think it would be also very naive to believe that certain actors, such as the EU, do not have a vested interest in the agenda of NGOs. I think we'd be very naive to believe that the EU, perhaps on their wish list, would like to see the disappearance of a nation state par excellence, such as Israel. In the sense, the EU is not, essentially speaking, a European organization. It is the very essence of anti-European. It wants to dissolve the European state. And Israel, to a great extent, offers a perfect example of how to dissolve the EU. They want to use it as an example. I put this possibility to you.
Look, I cannot comment on what is, whether the EU has some hidden agenda. I do think that there is a very clear political agenda. If you look at the EU says that it supports a two-state solution. This has been the official EU line for years.
So does the PLO. The best place to have a non-Israel solution is by supporting a two-state solution.
Look, they say they support it. I don't, I'm not a politician, so I don't want to comment.
I'm just raising these issues. I'm talking about, let's try to join the dots together here.
No, for sure. So I want to give you an example.
Yeah. Just let me say one more thing, and then,
sure.
For example, they're fully aware of what goes on in the Palestinist educational system, within the media. These people are the recipients of EU funding. I think even the meanest of intelligences should be able to fathom reality, that this is an organization which makes this type of thing possible.
Yes. The EU is the largest donor of the Palestinian Authority, and that includes pay for slay issue, right? The salaries to the terrorists who serve in their sentence in Israeli prisons, which is absurd. It's a tautology. A normal brain should not be able to process this information, right? It also includes funding to Palestinian textbooks, which we know are extremely anti-Semitic, extremely hateful towards Israel, Israelis, and Jews, are glorifying martyrdom and jihadist ideas, and so on and so on. And finally, then they also support the civil society, right? NGOs, both here in Israel and the Palestinians. And if you want to put that in the context of the political line that the EU supports, so you have a situation where the EU says, I support a two-state solution, okay? The two-state solution right now, following Oslo, whether we like it or not, some people approve, some people don't, some people think it was the worst thing, some people, it doesn't matter. This is the fact. The idea behind that, and following Oslo agreements, Oslo Accords, was that where the borderline will be decided at a negotiations table. But in practice, you have EU and many other European governments that support both Palestinian and Israeli NGOs that are trying to state facts on the ground, where they basically, this is what they're portraying, they have already decided that Area C will be Palestinian, because this is, this is what is happening in practice. Now, if you combine that with the fact that on the Palestinian side, they support NGOs, some of which are actually proxies of terror organizations, but almost all of them, they are the ones spearheading the campaigns against Israel at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It is the Palestinian organizations in conjunction with groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that are filing lawsuits against governments around the world in the last 2 years, trying to prevent them from supplying Israel with arms, right? Trying to de facto impose an arms embargo, and so on and so on. Then you understand that in practice, the EU is taking a very proactive, changing the reality on the ground stand that
Indeed.
surpasses what its official
Indeed.
policy is.
Indeed, I would even say that it is mirror imaging the PLO plan of phases.
And not only that, Marco, but last year there were talks of revising EU funding to the Palestinian Authority, and there was a memorandum of understanding signed with the PA that included revising textbooks, not including pay for slay, and some other revisions in the reforms that the PA was supposed to do. But the two things that almost no one mentions about this, at the end of the memorandum of understanding, it said this MOU is not legally binding for either side. So it's basically, let's sign an MOU and call it completely obsolete right away. But an even worse thing happened in March, so just 3 months ago, that the EU allocated a new batch of funding to the Palestinian Authority, stripping any and all conditions. So again, what is the reality? We had October the 7th, which is the worst pogrom of Jews since the Holocaust. And who is being rewarded? The PA is being now portrayed as the only logical replacement for Hamas, which anyone who knows and understands the conflict a little bit understands is silly at best, right? But even on them, they're not imposing any conditions and asking for any reforms. So basically, the international community is saying, we don't really care. Let's just go back to what was before.
Right. Let me say one more thing, and then I'll give others a chance, and I apologize for having taken so much time. Let me throw a little spanner in the works. What can you tell us about the Perez Peace Center? Because I believe that is an NGO as well.
Well, we don't follow them. They don't, from what I know, they don't deal with human rights issues or advocacy. And I wouldn't know if they receive governmental funding because
no, I'm not talking about them receiving governmental funding. So, I'm talking about their activities. Yeah.
I know, but I deliberately state these two because these are the two factors that they're decisive regarding which NGOs we Monitor. So
Right.
Paris Center for Peace would not be an NGO that would be on our.
It's now
list.
called the Paris Center for Innovation. They kind of realized it's not.
So it's, well, that's a very good marketing ploy, certainly. Good, because innovation brings peace, doesn't it? Ostensibly.
Yeah, I think they kind of realized it's not really going in that direction. But
Yeah.
but the thing is, it's not just Europe, and it's not just European NGOs and Europeans. There are or the world, the global media running this campaign. The Israeli media has joined in the campaign, this starvation campaign, with full force, and the mainstream media, and is not exhibiting any criticism whatsoever. The New York Times had it on the front page, so it must be true. And they have this deal where they have this Israeli reporter, Israeli journalist named Barak Ravid, who writes for Ynet and for the New York Times, and he appears on one of the Israeli channels, 12 or 13. And then he'll write an article, this huge article, together with other people in the New York Times. And then Ynet and the Israeli television will say this appeared in the New York Times, where he's the source of it. So it's just crazy. It's 20 years now since the disengagement. Exactly. We're right at the 20th anniversary. And to look back, there's a documentary being aired every evening now on Channel 14 about the disengagement. Very, very interesting, in 4 episodes. And on one of the first or the second episode, there's a very intelligent woman who lived in one of the communities in Gush Katif, and she's talking, and the interviewer asks her, has anyone asked you for forgiveness for what happened 20 years ago? No, he said, have you forgiven anybody? Have you forgiven all these people that she was talking about? They said they'd never asked for forgiveness. And even today, with October 7th so fresh in our minds, they do not admit that it was a mistake. So, we're bashing our heads against the wall. We don't really have a democracy here in Israel. Israel is a democracy in name only, because a democracy means that you elect people to the government and they do what their voters want them to do. And that's not what happens here in Israel. Anytime the government decides to do something that the left doesn't agree with, it goes to the High Court of Justice. And again, with the NGOs supporting. And if you look at the docket in the High Court of Justice, you see that most of the cases that they see are Arabs from Judea and Samaria suing the Israeli government for something. Case after case after case. And there's this NGO, I don't even remember the name of it, that was representing the prisoners, the Nokba prisoners that were taken, the Hamas murderers from October 7th, argue in court that their diet isn't rich enough in fruits and vegetables. And the president of the Supreme Court says, my door is always open to you. I mean, we're really bashing our heads against the wall here. We're doing this to ourselves. Obviously, the European governments who are contributing, and the NGOs and so on and so forth, they're all responsible. But we're mostly responsible because we're letting it happen right here under our noses.
Look, all these issues I want to challenge you here a bit. All these issues are extremely painful, and to most of us, highly personal. We all know people who died or were kidnapped, right, on October the 7th. We all know families whose dear ones are still held there. We all have friends who have, some of them died, were killed in the war, or continue to serve 4th round and 5th round and so on. At NGO Monitor, we still have 2 colleagues who are still in the reserve duty as we speak, and it's been 20 months. So it's them and their families. So all these issues are extremely emotional and personal. I have some of the things that these NGOs or these people say make my blood boil, literally. And yet, I don't have an issue with them taking it to the streets. You know, I went to the theater last Thursday at Habima Square, and the big demonstration to stop the war and for hostages was there. And I was looking at the crowd that showed up. Some of these people were the families of the hostages, their friends. Some people showed up to show their support because they feel frustrated that there's nothing else to do. But some of these people were holding banners that made my stomach go upside down. You know, some of them were comparing the Israeli government to the Nazi regime. You know, some of them are seemingly conscious objectionists, so they were basically calling for no military army and so on and so on. But to me, as horrible as it was to read some of these things, this is democracy. So
I do not agree. I do not agree with you in the least there.
I know, and I'm deliberately being a little bit controversial here, right? I don't mind them doing that. What I mind is when it is funded by another government.
Look,
okay?
I think
Because
it's obvious to everyone that the demonstrations, first before the war, during the year before the war against the judicial reform, and then when the war started again, this was such an obviously massively funded operation. This wasn't grassroots, protests. These were, those billboards, the huge billboards on the Ayalon highway, they're extremely expensive, and the whole place is plastered with them. I know because, sometimes I give money, to these crowdfunding for a billboard. It's very, very expensive. You have to have a lot of money. And now we hear that USAID was contributing. They got through USAID almost $1 billion in the past few years. So, that's not the problem. The problem isn't people holding a picket sign on the corner. That's, I think we all agree that that's, what democracy means, that you can say whatever. Freedom of speech is when you say things that are hard for people to hear, not when it's what you want to hear.
Not quite.
Having massively funded demos week after week after week after week, that's not democracy.
But at the end of the day, we're talking about an act of subversion. No country in the midst of the war applies democracy to the full extent that it would in a situation of normality. All you have to do is look at British wartime legislation, which was perfectly reasonable. They took these people and they separated them from the rest of society. Delinquents such as Oswald Mosley and his British Union of Fascists were put to one side. You cannot have people disrupting the lives, the economy, and the functioning of a society in wartime. Democracy cannot be the be-all and end-all of everything. Democracy is great when we have the right conditions. There are conditions when democracy, as we perceive it in normal times, you may just have to suspend disruption, burning tires, so on and so forth. These are exceptional situations. Israel is facing a war on 7, 8, 9, 10 fronts. Now, people who harp on about democracy when Israel's in the midst of a war for its very existence don't have the right priorities. We can talk about democracy to its full extent in a situation of peace or relative calm. Sorry about that.
Well, I beg to differ. It's very hard to draw the line.
I want to go in a different direction.
What is used against the left can be used against the right, and it was used against the right. That's my issue. My issue would go back 20 years again, where people were arrested on their way to a protest. Before they even got to the protest, the buses were stopped.
Right. But there's a qualitative difference in the action.
It doesn't matter. In that, I'm not even going to that point.
I know, but it's
that's not really democracy if only one side is allowed to express itself.
That's not the point. I'm talking about in a situation of war.
I understand what you're saying.
That's the situation. Left or right cannot disrupt an economy, a society, or demoralize a society in a wartime situation. These certain things have to be curtailed. It's not normality here. It's not Scandinavia. We're in the Middle East. We have people who have beheaded children, burnt children alive. Our first priority has to deal with this. Democracy to its
You're
full
going to
extent.
have to find another example. Scandinavia doesn't work anymore.
Not anymore. Not anymore. But we'd be on the road to that if we let it continue. That's what I'm saying.
Let's do another conversation on democracy, because I think that's another 19 minutes, as Olga said. 19 minutes won't be enough to cover all these topics. So I think we already realized
but
that.
we agree that we don't live in democracy anyway, so there's no
going
democracy to suspend.
Marco, we'll do a separate conversation, I promise. So we already realized that the funds are going on the wrong direction, okay? I think we all agree on that. We don't agree exactly when it comes to democracy, because we agree that the funds are being misused, okay? So our assessment,
you just have to look at the leaders of Hamas who have become billionaires. You know, they're sitting in Hamas with billions in their bank accounts.
Yeah.
Nobody even mentions that.
Yeah. So what can we do to stop the funds going in the wrong direction? Should we tackle the system? Should we inform the citizens? What's the best approach? What will be our methodology to make it or to put an end as soon as possible? Because this is not sustainable, and we are going to pay a price sooner or later, Olga.
Well, we have been paying the price, and we continue to pay the price. But moving forward, we are now in the peak of talks, right? And hopefully there will be some agreement, if one can call it an agreement with a terrorist organization like Hamas, that will result in the end of war for the sake of our soldiers and for the sake of our country, and also for the sake of the hostages, right? And that will at the same time allow Israel to protect its borders and to protect its citizens. But that is not the point. The point is that we are probably looking at some sort of resolution in a foreseeable future. And it is already one of the key questions, the question of humanitarian aid, right? And the funds, the incredible funds that will be needed to rebuild, restore Gaza, not only for food, right? Because now everyone is about starvation, but there will be a lot of money needed, billions, to rebuild Gaza and the society and life there. And it is crucial. It is truly crucial to make sure that the humanitarian aid is distributed after the war differently than it was before the war or during the war. This has been one of the main issues, right? When we say aid, humanitarian aid, most people think in physical terms. And even now, when people were visiting the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution centers, everyone was showing sacks of rice and flour and so on. But what very few people know is that a significant portion of humanitarian aid goes into advocacy projects. When the United Nations asked for an emergency appeal for the last quarter of 2023, which is basically the 3 months following October the 7th for Gaza, they asked for $1.4 billion, and they stated 3 objectives that would be addressed with this. The third one was political advocacy, which, it blows your mind. This is in the peak of the war, the humanitarian catastrophe, people being displaced, going from one part of Gaza to another, rows of civilians, and yet the United Nations are asking for projects to be supported that deal with political advocacy. Now, when you dig into what these projects are, too often those are exactly the same NGOs that advocate in The Hague against Israel, or advocate, or work with Hind Rajab in Belgium that persecutes Israeli soldiers, and so on and so on and so on. So both for the physical aid, there are mechanisms that need to be put in place on how physical aid needs to be controlled, whether these are tracked, controlled, checkpoints. And I'm not an expert. There are books written on this issue. USAID is typically better in vetting the humanitarian aid than any European counterpart. So, there's also a lot of best practices here, but on the issue of advocacy, right? So non-material aid, there is much to be done. And this includes UNRWA, right? And this includes the schools and the textbooks. These are all non-physical aid funds, and we need to literally condition them. There's no other way to go about it. And in a way, this has nothing to do with Israel, meaning this is the work that needs to be done in each of the capitals around the world. They need to put on paper clear conditions, what the money is not going to go to and who the money is not going to go to. So, for example, Germany, the German parliament in November last year passed a parliamentary resolution that defined the lowest common denominator. And that was, they said, anyone who does not recognize Israel's right to exist cannot and will not get a dime of German money on German soil and outside. And I don't know if you know this, but immediately 2 Israeli NGOs were stripped of German governmental funding. It was insane. They were bragging on this on social media. They were brought to the German embassy in Tel Aviv, and they were asked, do you recognize Israel's right to exist? And they could not answer positively. So the Germans said, well, no money. Now, it is much more difficult to implement this on Palestinian NGOs because of the context and who the players are. Many people will tell you there are no other NGOs, right? I mean, there are no Palestinian NGOs that do not support BDS. This is a political reality. This is the culture on the Palestinian side. Many people who deal with aid will tell you humanitarian aid organizations in Gaza could not operate if they weren't towing the line, right, with an Israel critical opinion publicly, because they needed some level of coordination with Hamas, right, to be able to reach the population. But if we want this reality to change, that we need a deep shift in paradigm. And I've been arguing this since pretty much November 2023. It is not a matter of UNRWA or no UNRWA. Of course, UNRWA is part of the problem. UNRWA is the institution that allowed October the 7th to happen, right? We know that there was abundance of evidence how they were complicit, how some teachers held hostages, some schools were used to as launching spots, and so on and so on. But that is not the point. The point is that whoever will be distributing aid, whoever will be operating kindergartens and schools and so on in Gaza, will have to work with the same 35,000 local contractors and people. And if these are not taught what is not allowed, then we're going to end up exactly in the same place. We're just going to call it differently. If a Palestinian teacher does not go into the classroom knowing that if he or she calls for a one-state solution, or says from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, or says that killing Israelis is the greatest value, and so on, and if they don't know that they will be sanctioned, then it doesn't matter if their paycheck is written by UNRWA or by someone else. And in that sense, the international community and each individual government, they have to start putting in place specific rules. Now, the UN, because it's important to know that the UNRWA is only one out of approximately 34 UN agencies that are active in Israel and the Palestinian context. So it's very emblematic, and the UN is extremely important because they coordinate most of the donations and most of the aid, right? As opposed to governments around the world in the I call it enlightened democratic world, with all its challenges, but still, right? And when we say international community, people think it's this huge thing. At the end of it, it's 30 countries, right? This is what it is, because the rest of the countries in the world are not democracies, and they don't, the ones that provide aid are countries like Qatar, so there's not much talks there and conditioning. But as opposed to the EU or Germany or UK or US, the UN does not have a strategy on combating anti-Semitism. The UN has not adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition on what constitutes anti-Semitism today. The UN does not have a terror list. I mean, think about it for a second. So how, this is how Palestinian terror-affiliated NGOs were allowed to lobby UNICEF for years to put IDF on the same blacklist with Boko Haram and Daesh for allegedly abusing children's rights in arms conflict. This is UN to you, and this is UNICEF. We're not talking UNRWA. UNRWA is the most symbolic of UN agencies. So we need to address these issues first and foremost on a legislative level and in the biggest capitals around the world. And the governments need to mobilize themselves with guts, with courage, pulling out funds from UNRWA and from the Human Rights Council, like a step that was made by the US government, right, is the only way to go, because the only language that these institutions understand is less money. And then, because then this is the only way for them to understand that they will have to change something moving forward. Otherwise, the system like the United Nations will protect itself. People say United Nations. United Nations is a parliament that has nothing to do with democracy. Most of the member states are not liberal and not democracies. And yet every country has that same one vote. So if you look at it like that, of course, most of the resolutions and most of the statements and most of the decisions issued by the United Nations are ridiculous and have nothing to do with the Declaration of Universal Human Rights or with protecting human rights or, liberties of the minorities. Because when Iran, heads the Committee on Women, or is the rapporteur for the report on women issues, then we understand what we are talking about. So I think we have to insist on governments in the international community, in the developed world, right, to go back to the basics and set the lowest common denominator that must not be crossed. If this does not happen, and Israel and the Israeli government needs to absolutely insist on this, then ultimately nothing will change on the ground. Because the minute, and I think it's important to understand what will come soon. The minute that international delegations and journalists are allowed into Gaza, the starvation campaign will look like a walk through the park. I am sure that there will be digging mass graves, alleged mass graves. There will be commissions of inquiry. There will be independent forensic investigations and so on and so on. We have a very rough couple of years ahead of us as the follow-up to the last 20 months. And the fact that Gaza was sealed, right, for anyone from the outside for obvious reasons. It's a war zone. And it will be very difficult to argue with governments that they now need to pause and legislate or condition aid, because the pressure on them to release money at any cost will be so immense that most of them, and we have seen this happen so many times, will just succumb. I've been arguing that this needed to happen 15 months ago. These conversations needed to start, needed to have started, right, a while ago, because these processes also take time. It's a cumbersome legislative and policy process to change some policies on the ground. So, but I don't see another way moving forward in terms of aid. If not, we will just go back to the same. I'm sorry to bum you.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I want to ask Ruchie, when it comes to censorship, I think it's one of your favorite topics. It boils your blood for sure. So even if Israel is able to share what's going on in Gaza, and have the right mechanisms, let's say the proper technology, the good individuals on the ground we all know that the receptors are not prepared because they are biased. So what can we do about having the audience prepared to hear the message and not constantly fail?
You know, Israel is always accused of having very bad public diplomacy, which is called hasbara in Hebrew. And it's true. It's true. But, you know, it's very, very hard to fight people for whom the truth doesn't matter at all. So we always try, people are always complaining. For example, let's take the example that happened in the war, at the beginning of the war, when that hospital was supposedly bombed by Israel, and supposedly 50 people were killed, and then it turned out that very few people were even hurt, and it wasn't Israel at all. It was a failed missile of the Hamas that hit the hospital, and so on and so forth. But it took the IDF spokesman, I don't know, 4 or 5 days to respond. Why? Because it had to investigate to make sure that it would be telling the truth. And it's impossible. It's an impossible situation when you are trying to tell the truth and nobody gives you the credit for that, and they're immediately the accusations, what we saw with the New York Times. I'm not saying there aren't hungry people in Gaza. Of course there are hungry people in Gaza, but they're hungry, number one, because Hamas wants them to be hungry, and number two, because they're not following the instructions that they were given to go to,
but
Hamas
Ruchie,
isn't letting them go to the centers where the food is available.
I think it's even more important to insist on this point. Of course, there's hungry people in Gaza. There's a stampede of 50,000 people storming the distribution centers. But to say that Israel is using starvation as a method of war is ridiculous. This is the problem. The problem is not having an honest conversation whether there's hungry people in Gaza. Of course there are. It's a war, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing sterile about it. But to accuse Israeli, like IDF, of using starvation as a tool of war, that is where the campaign
there is a
is
huge
malicious.
issue. There's a huge elephant in the room. You know, the Holocaust is a huge stain on the conscience of the world. And the only way they can clean their conscience is by saying that we are worse. So they're
Exactly.
always going to look
Yeah.
for ways to accuse us of what they want to do, what they did do, what they would do, and so on and so forth. That's always going to be the underlying psychological mechanism why they're always accusing us. Now, what the left accuses the right of, that's, we know, is what they're actually doing. And the right probably would never dream of doing, and that's why very often we lose in that battle, because we're not willing to do the things that the left is willing to do. And in this case also, we know it's basically a lost battle. So, you know, it's true that the hasbara, that the public diplomacy is not as effective as it should be. It's not as quick as it should be, but I don't know if it would really make a difference. I don't know. And yes, I think we're going to face a very, very difficult period after the war, when it is over, in terms of our image in the world. Look, I think it was Yoram Chazoni wrote an article about Europe drawing the wrong conclusions from World War II and what happened. That because of what happened of the Nazis and the Nazism, they completely want to do away with nationalism. Nationalism was not at fault in World War II. That was not what was behind Nazism. And they formed the EU. I remember back in the day, I was, you know, I never thought it was a great idea, because there's something in my mind, basically they're erasing national identities to some extent, and they're erasing the borders, and they're erasing national identity. And what they have now also is they've opened up their borders from outside and allowing mass migration of Muslims into Europe. They're changing the character of Europe completely. They're not having children. They haven't been having children or now for a couple generations. And the only ones having children in any serious number are the Muslims in Europe. This is a fact. You know, I don't know if there's any way to reverse that situation. So yeah, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to tell you, Vitor, how Israel can respond well when the game is fixed. It's fixed against us.
I would just add one thing, Ruchie, like you cannot change the others. You can only improve yourself.
That's true.
So you cannot.
Yeah,
so
yeah, no, I think we
that's the
must
only
do
answer.
better. We definitely must do better. There's no question. But I'm not I mean, there are people we'll never be able to convince, but there are people in the middle that can be convinced if they're shown the truth. And we have to work harder at that. Yes, absolutely, that is true.
Yeah,
I think what you say. Sorry, what you say about the EU is we agree on that. I think that, and what we see is a similar process that they're trying to foist upon Israel with the NGOs, because the EU started slowly and crept up slowly but surely upon the nation states of Europe, and
Absolutely.
they're disintegrating before our very eyes. They're disintegrating before our
Absolutely.
very
And
eyes.
Israel is the quintessential
Exactly.
nation state. And so we are like a finger in their eye all the time in that sense. And they are completely ignoring the fact that the whole creation of the Palestinian people is aimed at destroying Israel as a Jewish state.
Indeed.
There's
and they
no
willing
way there's
yeah,
no
sorry.
way you can have a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. So those who favor the two-state solution, even the Palestinians are against two-state solution. I mean, that we know that for a fact. But even those who claim to be in favor of a two-state solution, they don't want a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. They want a binational state and a Palestinian state that eventually will become an Arab state and not a Jewish state.
Indeed.
But I think that the ties are changing. I think, as a European on the call, I've been saying this, well, you're Portuguese also, like, right, Vitor? So I'm not the only European. I think
I stopped being a European when I made Aliyah.
I wouldn't write off Europe that quickly. I agree with you somewhat, Ruchie. I think that the European Union was a fabulous economical union that needed to happen so that the European continent can give an answer economically to other powers like US, like China, right? Because the markets were just too big compared to a collection of smaller countries in Europe. I think even opening borders economically was a wise thing to create this union. But so that's where I disagree with you. Where I do agree with you is that once the European Union, and this started actually with Council of Europe in the late 90s and early 2000s, started saying that the mantra of the European Union is all different, all equal, which basically means we want you to have a religious, ethnic, national identity, but we don't want you to practice it. We want you to couch it in museums and institutions and books, and we want you to every once in a while commemorate it, celebrate it at a festival.
But in practice, festival,
yes. But in practice, we want you to be all the same. A, religious, and A, national, to eat the same food, speak the same language, buy in same shops, and so on. And I'm not anti-globalization, don't get me wrong, but I think it's counterintuitive and it is not natural to ask of any one nation to strap itself from its national identity and national history. I think each nation should be proud of its national heritage. And ultimately, that is what creates a country. That is what creates a people, right? And I think, and to my mind, there is no contradiction between a thriving democracy, in which everyone has the same right and the same duties. By the way, because democracy, I come from a less democratic country. I was born into a socialist country. In democracy, the lesson about your rights is the easy one. Everyone gets that one. But the lesson when you're supposed to learn what are your duties in a democratic society, most people skip that one. But to me, there's no contradiction between a thriving democracy, which guarantees equal rights and duties to all its citizens, that has a national identity. For the love of God, Switzerland is a Christian country. It has a cross on its flag. In Europe, Sunday is a day of rest, and it is because it was a date that people went to church. Europe is a Christian continent. Now, because they forgot sort of what it means to practice, they today refer to it as if it was the secular thing. And then there's a cognitive dissonance why we insist on having a Jewish democratic state. And I do think that this goes hand in hand with now progressive ideologies, and it's sort of post-national and post-democracy.
But it's
right?
post everything. It's post
It's
all
post
the
everything.
values. It's post family. It's post loyalty. It's
But I
post
think
everything
yes.
that creates a vibrant, growing, thriving society. It's just like a
But I
family.
think,
Another
but I think
family,
that
a
there's a
community.
reverse. Yeah, I agree with you. But I think there's a reverse trend in the world in the last decade. If you look at Europe, Sweden has the furthest right government since the Second World War. Italy has some will say far-right government in place, right? The Netherlands, Austria, Poland, I can go on and on. More and more countries are electing, even in Belgium, right? That is considered the beacon of anti-everything, right? And so I lived in Brussels for 2 years. Even 15 years ago, it felt like a Muslim city, let alone today. And yet, even there are more conservative forces. Look at Germany. AfD is considered a far right, out of the political consensus party, but no one can argue that they won 20% of the popular vote. Look at France. Macron was able to create a government just because he did some political maneuvering, right? Not because he really won the popular vote. And let's not talk about Trump, right, in the US. So I think there's an awakening.
The question if it's not too late. The question if it's not too late. Demographics is something that takes a long time to build, and it can be destroyed in just a couple generations.
Indeed, it is working against. I mean, the European Union has worked against the notion of the family for years. People ask themselves, why should we have families? With the disconnection with the Judeo-Christian tradition. By the way, the idea to include it in the European Constitution was voted down within the EU itself. Now, if you don't have an idea of who you are, you don't really know where you're going. Okay? And this at official level is still the policy.
I want to finalize with a question about Serbia, since we have Olga in this session. So we also dreadful events of anti-Semitism in different parts of Europe. I mean, I'm not going to list because we'll be here forever, but I recall one in Italy, another one in Spain, France, Ireland,
Greece,
Ireland,
Greece, Belgium.
Yeah, plenty. There are plenty.
Austria,
but I'm not aware.
Just last week.
Yes, just last week. But I'm not aware of anything happening in Serbia. And just from my own experience, I visited Belgrade once, and I didn't feel any dangerous vibe when it comes to exposing Jewish artifacts or kippah or something like that. So what's the situation now in Serbia when it comes to this dreadful anti-Semitism going all parts of the planet?
So I think that Central and Eastern Europe is different than Western and Northern European countries, by and large. But then if so even if you look at countries like Czechia or Slovakia, or even if you go to the Baltic countries, you will have much less anti-Semitism than
Hungary and Poland, much less.
Absolutely.
They
Exactly.
take turns. They take turns.
Yeah.
This is not their century. This is the century of Western Europe's anti-Semitism.
That is not to say that there's no anti-Semitism. And in many of these places, actually, it's actually a very interesting question that you ask to sort of bounce off each other the two manifestations of anti-Semitism. You have in Central and Eastern Europe, you still have anti-Semitic sentiments that are old school.
Classic.
Some of them,
Yes.
classic, medieval anti-Semitic tropes, you have a lot
more
of
religious anti-Semitism.
also a lot of Judophilia, which if, many people will say it's not anti-Semitism. I think it's just the backdrop side of the same coin. I grew up in Serbia when most of the people around me until today will say, you Jews are so well connected, your Jewish friends around the world will help you get this or help you get that. Well, I was even asked on Serbian national TV this past year in a live show in a studio. I was asked, knowing, this is what the journalist said, knowing that the Jews control the media, how do you explain, Olga, that Israel is losing the media war? And my mind was exploding, right? But now it's as anti-Semitic as anything else, but people don't necessarily understand that it's anti-Semitic, and it's cushioned as almost admiration as to how connected our community is and so on.
That's like I once read that back in the day in China, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was considered a pro-Jewish book, and they admired the Jews for controlling the media and the world and the banks and so on and so forth.
Exactly. So so you still have a lot of that. And I don't think that there was, I'm not stating any statistics here, right? So I can't back this up with a survey, but it's just my sort of feeling. I wouldn't even say that there's more or less of that because of the war now, or because of what, and that is, there is less anti-Israel sentiments. This has been changing. The war since October the 7th in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans, just like everywhere else, in the beginning, there was much more sympathy, and interest to talk about, they wanted to interview me and ask me everything from hostages to the rockets and how my kids are coping with it and everything. And then relatively quickly, it all became, yes, but the poor people of Gaza, right? And what you are doing to them. And
that's true in Israel too. That's true in the Israeli media too.
We have plenty of anti-Semites in Israeli media.
The morning after the first Iranian attack, right? I was interviewed for a Serbian TV, and the journalist asked me, but it looks as if it wasn't really serious, because you this morning, we see, went back to your regular business. And this is not anti-Semitic, but it does show, how quickly the anti-Israel sentiments became prevalent. So yes, it did influence the public opinion, but still there is much, much less Israel-focused anti-Semitism than is the case in Western Europe. Yet we have to be very careful not to underestimate and not to undermine, because the progressive voices that are often motivated by local politics, or most of the times they're actually motivated by local politics, they, in any country and in Serbia as well, will resort to intersectionality in a minute, because they will advocate for, I don't know, here's an example. Everyone has heard of Srebrenica, right? Now it's a huge thing in Serbia, right? Whether it was really a genocide or it wasn't. And the Serbs will say, even if there were mass graves, you cannot be only talking about Muslim victims, because there were mass graves of Serbs during this. Every war is bloody, right? And the war in Bosnia was as politically messed up as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But you saw immediately the same people advocating for, in Serbia, so local people, left, progressive, right, advocating for persecute Serbia over Srebrenica genocide, so calling for the international community to apply sanctions, right, on Serbian government, they were the same ones that immediately would issue statements that were, calling for the same sanctions against the state of Israel and Zionism and in favor of the Palestinian people and poor civilians and so on. So the intersectionality today exists everywhere. And they were quick to also demonstrate a couple of weeks ago against the Serbian government, the same people, usually in, cultural circles and academic circles and so on. They were very quick to demonstrate against calling the Serbian government to stop supplying Israel with arms and ammunition, because actually, I don't know how many people know, but Serbia is one of the few countries, together with Czechia, that did not diminish, rather increased arms sales to Israel. So I say this with a grain of cautiousness, that the situation in Serbia is not as bad, because we still have to be very careful, because it's a slippery slope. And again, the politically motivated anti-Semitism today is much more dangerous than the one that comes from the classic prejudices, because the politically motivated one is almost automatically weaponized and translated into international pressure, media campaigns, and change of policies. And the other one, also the legislators and the authorities know what to do with it. If someone now denies Holocaust in Europe, they will be sanctioned, and almost every country has mechanism to do that. Whereas it is still a challenge in many countries for a local authority or police officer to tell the difference between when an activist is criticizing Israel and when that activist is, crying out something that is blatantly anti-Semitic.
Yes, Olga, to your point, I want to share an experience I had yesterday or the day before. Are you guys familiar with Reddit? So it's basically a platform where you can throw questions and ask people for their input. So I decided to join the Budapest forum, where people typically discuss Hungarian affairs. And my question was, why do we have a pro-Palestinian protest in Western Europe and not in Central Eastern Europe? I was very interested to see the locals' view. I got maybe like 15 answers. Half of them were saying, this is not our business. We are more interested in what's happening in Hungary, maybe in Ukraine. But what's happening in the Middle East is not Hungarians' interest. So this was half of the answers. The other half, there was only one person who was saying the Israelis are fighting their battle. They are struggling. They are trying to survive. So hats off for them. The remaining 5 or 6 were as disgusting as the progressives we see on the West. They were saying Israel is committing a genocide. Okay, it's not our business because we have to deal with Fidesz, etc. But they will be the same. I think the difference is they don't have the incentives that they have on Western Europe, and people need to deal with other struggles on a day-to-day basis. So to your point, Olga, I think you are right. These things still exist underneath. Just is not as vocal, but it's it's expressed in a very old-fashioned way. So I wouldn't be too confident to say that Jews can be safe, in Poland, Hungary, the next 10, 20 years, because this can all change in the blink of an eye. That's just my 2 cents on that. Yeah.
And by the way, not only in Europe, nowadays North America is actually 10 times worse in terms of anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, the North American Jewish community feels that much more threatened and at risk than the Jews of Europe. Maybe because the Jewish community in Europe is used to living with a certain amount of anti-Semitism at any given moment and has learned to cope with it, fortunately or not. But this is a reality. Anti-Semitism is not going anywhere. It's just, there's always going to be anti-Semitism. But I think that actually a much bigger challenge today is North America. I mean, the Jewish community in Canada is literally mortified at the overall atmosphere. So I think we should be on the watch on what is going on there and how the authorities are dealing with it.
Right. So I'm going to put an end in the discussion. As you said, Olga, at the beginning, 90 minutes wouldn't be enough. Well, that's a good sign. That's already a prediction that we'll have you again for another conversation, because I really enjoyed the chat. I think it was very fruitful from many angles. So thanks very much for being with us tonight. Ruchie, you are also welcome to be back anytime. We like your inputs, and yeah, I'll put an end on it. I need to. It's getting late here, although I'm not working tomorrow. I think I even heard on the background that just a personal story that I quit my daytime job without much of a backup, and probably people think I have access to some Jewish funds. That's why I can do that. So I'm pretty sure that's what people think. They don't verbalize because they are so jealous that they need to bite their nails. But I'm pretty sure it's on the back of their mind. So so if you want to support someone like me who just drop a daytime job and apparently have access to Jewish funds, make sure to press the subscribe button below. If you are satisfied with the content delivered, please press the like button, which is next to the subscribe. And if you know someone who's into this sort of conversations, make sure to share, because I'm here together with Marco every Wednesday. And I just want to announce for tomorrow, I have a discussion with an Italian film director, and we're going to focus on how Netflix is taking over cinema, which is also something that is changing society. So I think we need to understand what's going on when it comes to the world of arts, because it's not as it was, and maybe there are a lot of nuances that we can explore. But that's for tomorrow. For now, I just want to wish everyone a good evening, and I see you very soon. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.